Hello, and welcome to the third session of Module 2 of this training for strengthening planning capacities of MOA officials in OECS countries. This session will be dedicated to the analysis of costs and financing in an education system. What we would like to achieve in this session is for you to be able to understand the main sources and types of financing for education, and to identify the key indicators to analyze the costs and the financing of the education system. Why are we interested in costs and financing? The main reason is that we are always in a situation of limited resources, of constrained resources. And in that context, it's important to really understand where those resources come from and how they are utilized. This will enable us to identify possible opportunities for increased funding and to make sure that these resources are well spent and according to plans. It will also enable us, in some cases, to identify some possible areas where some efficiency gains can be made. Public finance reviews and the analysis of the use of public funds is also a matter of accountability to citizens and taxpayers. So let's look at the different sources of financing for the education system. If we want to map the different financing sources for education, the first one to mention is, of course, the government. The government is, in most countries, the main funding source for education. Governments typically run schools, provide infrastructures, pay the salaries of teachers, of administration. They may provide learning resources, etc. In most cases, as I said, this is the main contribution to education in most countries. One other contributor is households, families. Families contribute to education as a whole because they incur expenses, either direct, for instance, fees or uniforms, etc., or indirect, having to pay for transportation to the school, school meals, etc. In countries where private education is very present, the share of the total funding for education coming from households may be greater than in others. It exists some extreme cases where the total contribution of households actually exceeds that of the government. But again, this is relatively extreme. In most cases, the government is the main source of funding. Then we can think about NGOs, non-government organizations, and churches, which may contribute in different ways. They may run schools themselves for free. Sometimes they run schools for a fee, but they still contribute to the total cost of running that school. They may make available some infrastructures, some school facilities to the government to run schools in. They may provide support in terms of learning materials, provide support in terms of teaching staff, for instance, or they may also support directly in kind or financially schools in their area, schools or families, for them to help them to attend school or benefit from other education services. Another source of funding is public donors. Public donors may be bilateral or multilateral donors. Bilateral donors meaning foreign states who support the government and the education sector, or multilateral organizations such as typically the UN organizations or development banks like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. So they may contribute to directly into the total national budget in the form of general budget support, or they may contribute to the education sector specifically. Sometimes they have sector budget support, or they may contribute in the form of programs that are embedded within the national budget. They may also have projects that are outside of the national budget. The last type of financing resource or source for education that we may mention is private donors. So private donors may be individuals who contribute to education by supporting a school, for instance, not as a user, not as parents of a student, but just as an individual contributing, offering support to the local school, for instance. Mostly, however, when we talk about private donors, we refer to companies, possibly some private foundations, or some big companies within their corporate social responsibility programs. And there may also be some public-private partnerships with the government, with the Ministry of Education, to help run some education services. In this session, we will essentially concentrate on public funding to education, funding coming from the government. So let's look at the way public funding is structured and where it comes from in terms of national budget. What is important to understand is that essentially the whole of the resources that are available for the government to spend on education comes from the economic activity of the country. This economic activity is generally measured by the gross domestic product, which is essentially the wealth that is produced over a year by all the economic activity within the country. From this economic activity, the government extracts, in a way, public revenue. This public revenue comes essentially from taxes on income, but also taxes on companies, taxes on resources, all sorts of taxation which flow into the national resources. The public revenue is in fact also contributed to by external aid and possibly borrowing. So external aid is what we mentioned earlier in terms of public donors, sometimes private donors, but it's less common for public donors to contribute to the budget directly, but it happens. And also borrowing, the state borrowing money to pay for all the expenditures that it faces. So from the public revenue, the government draws its budget and its expenditure. Unfortunately, often there's also some debt servicing, some debt that the government has to pay before being able to plan for the rest of its expenditures. So this is essentially the budget that is available for the government. And at this stage occurs the first level of trade-off. From the total, within the total public expenditure, a portion will go to education, another portion will go to health, another portion will go to transportation, roads, will go to social protection, etc. So each sector will get a portion of the public expenditure. And within the education expenditure is a distribution, a trade-off in terms of the education levels, which will get different parts of this education expenditure. Primary, junior secondary, senior secondary, higher education, other levels, which may include pre-primary or TVET, technical and vocational education and training. It might also include learning programs for adults, etc. So these last two levels are what we call trade-offs. It's decision points for the government to make. The first one being an intersector trade-off, a decision to spend money on one sector or another. So education versus the other sectors. And the second trade-off point is the intra-sector trade-off within the education expenditure. How much money are we going to spend on primary versus junior secondary, senior secondary, higher education, etc. This last trade-off is not always explicit. It is sometimes the result of choices that are made in running those different cycles, and not always a clear decision of wanting to spend that exact percentage of the education expenditure on a particular education level. So from this, we can draw some first indicators to analyze public funding to education. The first indicator relates to the intersector trade-offs. It is the education expenditure as a percentage of the total public expenditure. How much the government decides to spend on education as opposed to, again, health or police, army, roads, etc. The second indicator is the share of the education expenditure that is spent on a particular education level, primary, senior secondary, higher education, etc. So these are two of the main indicators that you may analyze when you look at public funding for education. A third one is the total education expenditure as a percentage of the GDP. The reason why we look at this indicator is that depending on the economy and the taxation of a country, the proportion of the total wealth of the country, which is represented by the gross domestic product, that actually benefits education, may vary. So we directly look at education as a percentage of GDP, which also makes international comparisons easier. So let's look at these two indicators: the expenditure on education, examined as a percentage of the government expenditure and as a percentage of GDP. Here are some examples of data from OECS countries. We didn't name those countries because the data may be old. These are data from UIS, UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and you will look at your own data to calculate those indicators, but this can give you an idea of the range of those indicators. So for a few of the countries in the region, you see that the percentage of the government expenditure that is spent on education varies more or less between 8 and 19%. The education expenditure as a percentage of GDP varies between 2.5 and 8%. There is a conceptual difference in use between these two indicators. The education expenditure as a percentage of total government expenditure is generally used as an indicator of priority to education. How much does the government spend on education out of its total available envelope, as opposed to spending it on health or police or other sectors? So it's an indicator of priority to education. The education expenditure as a percentage of GDP, however, is generally used as an indicator of resources for education, comparing the funding, public funding for education to the GDP, which is the total wealth, the total economic activity of the country, indicates how much resources is available for education compared to the total wealth available in the country, and also in the context of the costs of salaries, of goods, etc., which are reflected in the GDP. The Education 2030 Framework for Action recommends as benchmarks that 4 to 6% of the GDP may be spent on education from public governments, and between 15 and 20% of the total government expenditure. If we look at our countries, again, in the region, the OECD countries, we'll see that most countries are below those benchmarks. But you'll see that they are not, those two indicators are not directly proportional. In country A, for instance, country A has a government expenditure for education as a percentage of GDP of around 3.5%, with only 10% of its total government expenditure spent on education. To reach that level of education as a percentage of GDP, so that level of resources for education in the context, in the perspective of the wealth and the economy of the country, countries B and D have to spend 14% of their total government expenditure. This is due to the structure of their economy in terms of the taxation that is in place, the economy that is taxable, etc. This concludes this third session of Module 2, which was dedicated to costs and financing of education. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to more exchanges with you.